The autumn of 1893 came hard to the Platte River country of western Nebraska, arriving not with the gradual cooling that made a man feel the season turning beneath his boots, but with a single cold front that dropped out of Wyoming on a Wednesday night and did not lift for 11 days. By the time the frost had gone deep enough to crack the surface of the stock tanks, and the cottonwoods along the river had lost their last leaves to a wind that carried grit from the bare fields to the west, the cattle ranchers of Custer County had already begun to understand that the summer's troubles had not finished with them. The panic of that same year had tightened credit at every bank from Omaha to Denver. Land prices had fallen by a third. The railroad's cattle rates out of Broken Bow had increased twice since spring, and the buyers at the Omaha stockyards were offering $32 a head for beef that had commanded $41 the previous October. It was a year that punished the marginal and the unlucky in equal measure, and it drew no distinction between those who had made poor decisions and those who had simply run out of time. Phoebe Ann Mosey had been 33 years old that autumn. She had not gone by that name in years. The world knew her as Annie Oakley, or Little Sure Shot, the woman who could cut a playing card edge-on at 30 paces and light 6 candles in succession before the match smoke cleared. But the world that knew her that way knew her in a canvas arena, with sawdust underfoot and 10,000 spectators cheering from tiered wooden seats. This was not that world. This was a rented house on the south edge of Broken Bow, Nebraska, a frame structure with a good well and a kitchen garden that had done well in spite of everything, and Annie Oakley had been living in it since the middle of August, for reasons that had nothing to do with exhibition shooting and everything to do with the particular misfortune that had arrived in the form of a letter postmarked Columbus, Ohio, in the last week of July. The letter had been from a doctor she did not know, writing on behalf of her sister Lydia, who had taken fever in June and had not recovered by any measure that mattered. Lydia was alive. She was not well. She would need, the doctor had written with the careful neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news many times, a longer period of convalescence than her husband could manage alone with 4 children under the age of 10. Annie had read the letter twice at the staging ground outside of Omaha, where Buffalo Bill's Wild West show had been camped between dates. She had gone to Frank Butler that evening, and Frank, who understood her better than anyone alive, had not argued with her and had not asked questions. He had handed her the train fare and told her to write when she knew more. The show had moved on without her, east toward Cleveland, and Annie had taken a train to Columbus and spent 3 weeks nursing Lydia back to a functional state, and then another week convincing herself that her sister was genuinely out of danger, and by the time she had trusted what she saw with her own eyes and permitted herself to leave, it was the 3rd week of August, and the show was 900 miles away in a different state. She had wired Frank from the Columbus depot. His reply had reached her at the next stop. The show was booked solid through November. The circuit was not coming back through Nebraska, and the nearest she would be able to rejoin them was Kansas City in the 2nd week of December. She could travel overland, or she could wait. He sent money for either option. He did not tell her what to do. He knew better. Annie chose to wait. She found a room in Broken Bow at a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Stribling, and Clara Stribling charged a fair rate and kept a clean kitchen and did not ask her lodgers to explain themselves. Within a week, Annie had moved from the boarding house into the small frame rental on the South Road, because she preferred to cook her own meals and needed space to practice, and because Clara Stribling's other lodgers included a man with a 2-year-old who screamed most mornings between 4 and 6, and Annie had learned young that she could endure almost anything except the sustained suffering of a child she could not help. She had been in Broken Bow for 2 weeks when she met Margaret Connolly for the first time. Margaret Connolly ran cattle on 480 acres northeast of town, up along the South Loop River, on land her husband Declan had homesteaded in 1879 and built into a working operation over 14 years of continuous effort. The place was called the Connolly Quarter, which was a local name and not an official one, and it carried about 140 head of mixed Hereford and Longhorn cross through any given season. By western Nebraska standards, it was a modest operation. By any honest measure, it was something built out of nothing by people who had refused to quit. Declan Connolly had died in the third week of September, 9 days before Annie Oakley learned his name. He had been 41 years old, an Irish-born cattleman who had come to Nebraska by way of Indiana, and a brief and unhappy period working the Kansas cattle trails in the early 1870s. He had been a big man, heavy in the shoulders, quiet in the way of men who do not need to demonstrate what they know. His neighbors said he was fair. His creditors said he paid on time. His wife said he could read a storm coming 2 days out by the way the cattle stood in the evening, and that he had never once been wrong. The cause of death was a rupture, the kind that comes without warning and without mercy, and does not leave a man time to put his affairs in order. He had been working the south pasture fence on a Tuesday morning, and he had been dead by Tuesday afternoon, and Margaret Connolly had found him when she drove the wagon out at noon with his dinner. She had 3 children. Thomas was 11. Bridget was 8. The youngest, a boy named James, who everyone called Jimmy, had just turned 4 in August and did not fully understand what had happened to his father, except that he was gone and was not coming back. Annie heard this in pieces over the course of 2 days, partly from Clara Stribling, who knew everything that happened in Custer County within 48 hours of its happening, and partly from the dry goods clerk at Halverson's store on Main Street, a man named Roy Pettigrew who had grown up 3 miles from the Connolly place, and who described the situation with the flat directness of someone who had not yet worked out what to do about it. Annie was buying flour and lamp oil when Roy Pettigrew told her that Margaret Connolly was going to lose the cattle. She said, "What do you mean she's going to lose them?" Roy Pettigrew set her flour on the counter and said that the fall drive was scheduled for the 2nd week of October, which was 3 weeks out. Every rancher in the county with a marketable herd drove their cattle to the railhead at Broken Bow in those 2 weeks, and from there they went by rail to the Omaha stockyards. It was a 40-mile drive from the Connolly place to the railhead. A drive like that required hands, and hands cost money. And Margaret Connolly did not have money for hands because the spring credit at the First National Bank of Broken Bow had been drawn against the summer operating expenses, and there was not enough left to hire the 2 or 3 men she would need for a safe drive. Without the drive, the cattle would not be sold. Without the sale, there would be no money to service the banknote that came due in December. And without that payment, the bank held the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings against the Connolly Quarter in the new year. Annie paid for her flour and lamp oil. She did not say anything else to Roy Pettigrew. She walked back to her rented house on the South Road and put the flour away and lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the early evening, watching the light change on the river cottonwoods through the south window. She was thinking about Margaret Connolly, who she had not yet met, and she was thinking about what it meant to have 480 acres and 140 head of cattle and no one to move them. She had grown up in Dark County, Ohio, in a family so poor that poor did not adequately describe it. Her father had died when she was 5. Her mother had been left with 7 children and a farm that could not feed them all, and Annie had learned to shoot before she was 10, because game was the difference between eating and not eating on certain winter weeks, and she had shot so well and so consistently that by the time she was 15 she had paid off the mortgage on her mother's house, with the earnings from selling game to restaurants in Greenville and Cincinnati. She knew exactly what it meant to hold a piece of land with nothing but your own effort and your own nerve, and she knew what it looked like when someone was about to lose it through no fault of their own. She was at the Connolly Quarter the following morning by 8 o'clock. Margaret Connolly was 40 years old, a compact and dark-haired woman with the kind of composed face that suggested she had cried as much as she was going to, and had now moved past crying into something harder and more durable. She was feeding chickens when Annie's rented buggy came up the lane, and she watched the buggy come without expression, with the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to assess every approaching thing for whether it carries help or trouble. She had not yet determined which this was when Annie stepped down from the buggy. They were not acquainted, but Margaret Connolly knew who she was. Almost everyone in Nebraska knew who she was. She had been shooting an exhibition since 1885 and had been the headline act of Buffalo Bill's show for 7 years. Her photograph had appeared on more broadsheets and theater bills than she could count. Margaret Connolly looked at her for a moment and then looked at the chickens and finished the last of the feed from her apron. Annie said she was sorry about Declan. She said she had heard what was happening with the cattle. She said she had come to ask how she could help. Margaret Connolly looked at her with gray eyes that had some red still in them from recent grief, and she said that she did not see how there was help to be had. The hands she needed cost $12 a man for a 2-week drive, and she did not have $24, and she did not have the credit to borrow it. And Roy Pettigrew's cousin at the bank had made it clear that no further advances would be extended against the Connolly account until the current note was serviced. She was not telling Annie this because she expected anything from it. She was telling her because she had been raised to answer a direct question with a direct answer. Annie said she understood. She thanked her for her time and drove back to Broken Bow. That is the version of the story as Annie Oakley understood it after one morning's visit. The fuller version, the one that Margaret Connolly lived and that her children would carry into the next generation, was considerably more textured and considerably more painful, and it had been building not just since Declan's death, but since the spring credit negotiations of April, when the First National Bank of Broken Bow had restructured the Connolly note under terms that were legal, documented, and written by a man who knew what he was doing. The bank's president was a man named Harlan Voss. He had arrived in Broken Bow in 1887 from St. Louis, Missouri, with capital and credentials, and the particular brand of optimism that men with capital tend to have when they survey land owned by people without it. He was not cruel by nature. He was efficient. He had a system for assessing agricultural risk, and that system had been developed in St. Louis for Midwestern grain operations, and it did not translate with any particular accuracy to the realities of Custer County cattle ranching, but it produced numbers, and the numbers produced decisions, and the decisions produced outcomes, and those outcomes had by the fall of 1893 foreclosed on 11 separate properties in the county, since the bank's founding 6 years earlier. The Connolly note had been written at 7% over 15 years when Declan first took it in 1885. In April of 1893, Harlan Voss had called Declan into the bank and explained that due to current economic conditions and a revaluation of the collateral, the bank was exercising its right under a particular clause in the original note to restructure the terms. The new terms required a balloon payment of $214 by December 15th of 1893, representing 3 years of accelerated principal, or the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings in January. Declan had read the clause. The clause existed. It said exactly what Voss said it said. There was nothing illegal about it. Declan had shaken Voss's hand and driven home and told Margaret, and Margaret had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that if the fall cattle sale went as planned, at $40 a head for 120 marketable animals, they would clear enough to make the balloon payment with roughly $60 to spare. It was tight. It was survivable. They had survived tight before. Then Declan died in the 3rd week of September, and the drive became impossible, and the arithmetic went silent. Margaret had gone to Harlan Voss herself, 2 weeks after Declan's funeral, with Thomas sitting beside her in the wagon, because she would not leave the children alone. She had explained the situation to Voss directly, in the same terms she would later use with Annie Oakley: the death, the drive, the hands she could not afford, the timeline. She asked for an extension of the balloon payment to the following spring, which would give her time to organize the drive after the ground softened and buyers returned to the market. Voss had listened to her with the attentive neutrality of a man who has heard many variations of a story and has a prepared response to all of them. He told her that the bank's obligations to its own depositors did not allow for unilateral modifications to note terms, however sympathetic the circumstances might be. He said this not unkindly. He offered her a glass of water, which she declined. He told her that if she could secure the balloon payment by December 15th, the note would continue on its existing terms. He did not suggest any mechanism by which she might accomplish this. Margaret drove home with Thomas beside her, and Thomas, who was 11 and already understood money in the practical way of ranch children, asked if they were going to lose the place. She told him not yet. She believed this when she said it. She was a woman who had not permitted herself to stop believing things until events gave her no other option. She tried 3 other avenues before Annie Oakley came to her door. The first was her brother-in-law, Patrick Connolly, who ranched west of town and might have lent her the $24 for hands, except that Patrick's own operation had been hit hard by a summer drought that had cost him 30 head to dehydration and illness, and he told her honestly that he did not have $24 liquid. The second was the Cattlemen's Cooperative out of Kearney, which had a small emergency fund for bereaved ranch families, but whose application process required a minimum of 60 days processing time, which put it 3 weeks past her deadline. The third was the county commissioner, a man named Arthur Dale who had known Declan for 8 years and who listened to Margaret with genuine sympathy and told her that there was no county mechanism for intervening in a private banknote restructuring, and that the law was the law in this respect, and that he was sorry. She went home after that last conversation and cooked supper for her children and put Jimmy to bed and listened to Thomas reading to Bridget from a book Declan had ordered from a catalog in Chicago, and she sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and understood that she had reached the end of the available roads. She was not broken by this understanding. She was not even fully surprised by it. She had grown up in County Clare in the early 1860s. The daughter of farmers who had survived the tail end of the famine, and she had absorbed from earliest childhood the knowledge that the world does not owe a person what they have earned. You build what you build, you hold it as long as you can, and sometimes you cannot hold it. She did not know that 2 miles away, Annie Oakley had driven back to her rented house on the South Road and spent the rest of the day thinking. Annie knew cattle. People who followed her career for the shooting did not always know this, but she had grown up around livestock in Dark County, and in the years since joining the Wild West show she had spent more time around working cowboys and cattlemen than most Easterners understood. Buffalo Bill's show traveled with live longhorns for the roping exhibitions, and Annie had worked alongside the cowboys who managed them on the road, and she had driven cattle in at least 5 different states as a participant in the show's roundup demonstrations. She was not a trail hand by profession, but she could ride, she could read cattle, and she could work a fence line, and she was not afraid of 40 miles of open country. She was also not afraid of doing something that had not been asked of her. This was not a new instinct. It was one she had carried her entire life. From the first mornings in Dark County, when she had gotten up before the rest of the family to clear snow off the chicken coop so the chickens would not freeze, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the chickens needed it and she was the first one awake. She had always been the kind of person who looked at a problem and thought simultaneously and without drama that it needed to be solved and that she was capable of solving it. Not everything could be solved. She had learned this too. But this one could. What she needed was a hand. One competent man who knew cattle and could ride the flanks while she worked the point. She had the driving instinct and the route knowledge and the authority. The particular kind of quiet authority that causes cattle to move in the direction you intend, without their knowing why. But she could not work 140 head alone across 40 miles of mixed terrain, river crossings included. She needed one man. She found him at the livery stable on the east end of Broken Bow's main street on the afternoon of the day she visited the Connolly Quarter. His name was Cole Weatherby, and he was 47 years old, and he had spent 22 of those years moving cattle on the western plains, and had arrived in Broken Bow 3 weeks earlier, following the dissolution of a cattle outfit out of Cheyenne, whose principal investor had lost his backing in the July banking panic. Cole Weatherby was not a man of large reputation. He was a man of specific competence and reliable habits, and he was currently employed cleaning stalls at the livery for $1.50 a day, and was not happy about it. Annie asked him if he could work a drive, what he charged, and whether he was available the second week of October. He said yes to all 3 questions. He charged $9 for a 2-week drive. She told him she would be in touch. She paid for everything herself. This requires some explanation, because Annie Oakley was not a wealthy woman in 1893 in any conventional sense, but she was a woman who had earned consistent money since the age of 15, and who had the particular financial discipline of someone who grew up with nothing and understood exactly what nothing felt like. Frank Butler managed their shared finances, but Annie maintained her own account at a bank in Cincinnati, and it held, at the time of these events, $112 and change, enough for the livery deposit, Cole Weatherby's wages, 3 weeks of provisions for a trail drive, and the shoeing and outfitting of the additional horses she would need from the Connolly string. She did not tell Margaret Connolly she was going to do this. She drove back out to the Connolly Quarter the following morning, a Thursday, 2.5 weeks before the scheduled drive dates, and she told her that she had a hand lined up and that she would drive the cattle herself as the second rider. Margaret Connolly looked at her for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked why. Annie said that she had the time and the ability, and that the cattle needed moving. Margaret said that was not what she had asked. Annie said she knew, and she smiled the way she sometimes did when she was declining to answer something, and Margaret, who was a perceptive woman, understood that this was the only answer she was going to get. She had known of John Wayne for a month before he arrived in Broken Bow. He came into the story the way he came into most stories, without announcement, without fanfare, with the particular unremarkable quality of a large man who has learned to enter rooms quietly. He was 50 years old that autumn, though he carried it like less. He had been born in Iowa and had come west young working cattle out of Texas before the drives ended and finding his way eventually to Montana ranching, where he had built and sold 2 separate operations over 20 years and had arrived at middle age with a reputation, a modest sufficiency of money, and the temperament of a man who has made his peace with most things. He was in Custer County because he had agreed to consult on a land purchase for an acquaintance in Billings, a 300-acre parcel northeast of Broken Bow that the acquaintance wanted assessed before making an offer. The assessment had taken 4 days. He had been planning to leave on Friday. He knew who Annie Oakley was. He had seen her shoot in Cheyenne in 1889, at an exhibition attached to a Cattlemen's Association gathering, and he had watched her put 12 rounds through a target the size of a man's fist at 50 yards, and had walked away, thinking that he had never seen anything done so well by any person in any discipline, and that she made it look like breathing. He had not met her then. He was not a man who went looking for introductions to famous people. He had been staying at the Grand Central Hotel on Broken Bow's Main Street, and on the Thursday morning when Annie drove back out to the Connolly Quarter, John Wayne had been in the hotel dining room eating breakfast and reading a week-old copy of the Omaha World Herald. Roy Pettigrew came in around 7:30 with a delivery for the hotel kitchen and stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee at the counter, and John Wayne, who had a habit of listening to conversations in public rooms without participating in them, heard Roy Pettigrew tell the hotel cook about Annie Oakley's plan to drive the Connolly cattle. He set down his newspaper. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked Roy Pettigrew how many head were in the Connolly herd, and what the country was like between the Connolly Quarter and the railhead. Roy Pettigrew told him, 140 head, mixed Hereford cross, reasonable temperament. The route ran northeast to southeast, 40 miles, with 2 river crossings, the South Loop near the start and a secondary crossing over the Middle Loop near Arcadia. The Middle Loop crossing had been running fast all autumn due to the rains in August, and it was going to be the hard point of the drive. John Wayne paid for his breakfast and left 4 times the amount on the table. He went upstairs and put on his trail coat. He rode out to the Connolly quarter by mid-morning. Annie Oakley was in the horse pasture assessing the Connolly string when he came up the lane, and she looked up from the horse she was examining, a solid gray gelding she was considering for the point work, and watched him ride in with the unhurried attention she gave to anything new in her vicinity. She recognized him, not from any personal acquaintance, but from the kind of recognition that comes when someone's physical presence matches a description you have heard several times. The height, the breadth of shoulder, the way he sat a horse as though the horse had been built for him specifically. She had heard his name from Buffalo Bill himself, in a conversation about Western men worth knowing, 3 years before this morning. He stepped down from his horse and took off his hat, and told her that he had heard she was planning to drive the Connolly cattle. She said that was right. He said he had nothing particular to do for the next 2 weeks and that he knew the Middle Loop crossing. She looked at him for a moment, measuring, and then she nodded once and said she would take him up on it and that he would be working for her wages, not her credit. He said that was fine, except that he would not take wages for this. She said that he would, because she did not work with men she could not pay, and there was a silence of approximately 3 seconds that had some weight in it. Then he said all right, and she named a figure, and he did not argue with the figure. Margaret Connolly came out of the house and stood on the porch watching this exchange. She had been watching the lane all morning because the drive preparation required decisions about her cattle and her horses, and she was the one who had to make them. She looked at John Wayne for a moment and then looked at Annie. She did not say anything, but something changed in her posture, the way a person's posture changes when they have been braced for a long time and are given, for the first time in weeks, a reason to stand up straight. The preparation took 12 days. Annie and John Wayne and Cole Weatherby worked the Connolly herd through the 2nd week of October, cutting the marketable animals from the breeding stock and the young, checking hooves and confirming weights, arranging provisions. Thomas Connolly, who was 11 and had been working cattle since he was 7, rode with them every day after school and on the Saturday and Sunday, and John Wayne worked with him without condescension, treating him as a working hand rather than a child, explaining the logic of what they were doing, and asking his opinion on the temperament of individual animals, in a way that made Thomas stand straighter and answer more carefully. Bridget brought them water from the house pump each afternoon at 3. Jimmy stood at the pasture fence and watched. Margaret worked the preparation alongside them in every hour she was not managing the house or the children, and she worked without conversation beyond what the work required. She was not demonstrative. She was thorough, and she knew her cattle as well as any person Annie had encountered, and she made every decision about her own herd with a clarity that came from 14 years of daily attention. On the 6th day of preparation, when they were working the sorting pen and a young heifer broke back through the cut, it was Margaret who turned her horse and brought the animal back in a single clean arc, before anyone else had moved, and Cole Weatherby said quietly to Annie that the woman could have done this drive herself if she'd had the hands, and Annie said she knew. They left at 4 in the morning on the 17th of October, a Thursday, in the darkness before the first light, with frost on the grass, and the cattle moving in a long, restless column south from the Connolly pastures toward the South Loop crossing. Margaret stood at the gate of the home pasture with the lamp and watched them go. Thomas was with them. She had decided this after a conversation with Annie that lasted an hour on the Tuesday evening, a conversation in which the word danger was not used once, because neither woman saw the point of using it when what they were actually discussing was necessity and capability. Thomas was 11 and could ride and had been working cattle since he was old enough to sit a horse, and he was the third-point rider they needed, and Margaret understood this and trusted it, and watched the cattle disappear into the dark. The South Loop crossing on the first morning was cold and fast but passable, and John Wayne went across first to check the footing and came back and said the gravel bottom was solid and they could cross in groups of 20. They spent an hour moving the cattle across in groups, Annie and Cole Weatherby working the near bank, and John Wayne and Thomas managing the far side. The cattle were cold and reluctant, and 4 of them turned back at the water and had to be worked through the second time. But by full light they were across and moving south with the first warming of the sun on their backs. 123 head, 17 had been cut as non-marketable. 123 head were going to Omaha. The country between the South Loop and the town of Arcadia was mixed grassland and dried corn stubble, mostly flat, with enough established trail that the herd moved at a consistent pace once they had warmed up. Cole Weatherby worked the right flank and Thomas worked the left, and Annie rode the point and John Wayne worked the drag, the dustiest and most demanding position on any drive, the place where the slow and the reluctant and the tired collected. He worked it without acknowledgement of its difficulty, steadily, covering the miles the same way he had covered all the miles of his life, without urgency and without wasted motion. The first night they camped on a flat stretch of public grazing land north of Arcadia, and Annie built a fire and made coffee and beans, and Thomas ate 2 plates and was asleep in his bedroll inside of 20 minutes. John Wayne sat with his coffee and looked at the fire for a while. Annie sat on the other side of the fire and cleaned her Winchester. Cole Weatherby smoked his pipe. Nobody said much, because there was nothing much that needed saying. The middle loop crossing on the second day was the thing John Wayne had warned about, and it was everything he had said it would be. The water was running at a height that came above the cattle's knees at the deepest point, and the current was enough that the animals could feel it pulling at their legs, and they did not like it. The footing was sand over gravel, which was less predictable than pure gravel, and the crossing point was 60 yards wide and angled slightly downstream, which meant the cattle had to be driven into the current at an angle and trusted to make the adjustment. John Wayne went in first again, this time on a long diagonal that took him downstream 40 feet before he found the firmest line across. He marked the line with a stick planted upright in the gravel at mid-channel, where the water ran at his horse's belly and the footing held. He came back. He told Annie the line. She told Thomas to hold the far left of the herd and not let them drift north. Thomas nodded with his jaw set. They crossed in groups of 15 this time, Annie driving each group in from the near bank, and John Wayne meeting them at the mid-channel stick and pushing them through the last 30 yards. Cole Weatherby worked the near bank. Thomas worked the far. The cattle did not like it, and several of them tried to turn, and 2 groups broke and scattered along the near bank and had to be collected and reapproached, and the crossing took 2.5 hours in 40-degree water that soaked everyone below the knee. But they crossed, all 123. They came into Broken Bow from the north on the evening of the second day, moving the herd down the broad cattle lane that ran along the east side of town toward the railhead pens. It was October 19th, a Saturday evening, and there were already other herds in the pens from ranchers who had driven in the previous 2 days, and the air smelled of cattle and coal smoke, and the particular combination of wood and iron that marked the presence of the railroad. The stockyard agents were working the pens, recording head counts and assigning lot numbers, and Annie rode up to the main agent, a man named Porter Stiles, who had been working the Broken Bow railhead for 11 years, and told him the Connolly cattle were in and ready for assessment. Porter Stiles looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the herd, and then he walked the perimeter of the holding pen with a practiced eye, and came back and said 123 Hereford Cross, reasonable grade, and gave her the per-head offer. The offer was $32. She said 36. He said 33. She said 35, and she was not going to 34. He looked at the cattle again and said 34.50. She held his gaze for 4 seconds and he said, "All right, 35, and wrote it in his ledger. 123 head at $35 per head came to $4,305. That was the number. That was what Margaret Connolly's cattle were worth in the market of October 1893, driven 40 miles by 3 adults and a boy of 11. John Wayne said nothing during the negotiation. He sat his horse behind Annie and to the left, and he watched Porter Stiles, and he watched the ledger, and he watched the number get written down. He did not comment on it. When Porter Stiles offered Annie the bank draft made out to the Connolly estate in the amount of $4,305, John Wayne stepped his horse forward and watched the draft exchange hands, and then he stepped his horse back. Thomas Connolly, who had been sitting his horse on Annie's right through the entire negotiation, looked at the draft in Annie's hand with eyes that were doing the arithmetic his mother had taught him. He was 11. He did the arithmetic correctly. He looked at John Wayne and then at Annie and did not say anything, but his face said everything. The draft went into Annie's coat pocket. She rode back to the hotel stable with John Wayne and Cole Weatherby. She paid Cole Weatherby his $9 from her own pocket, and she shook his hand, and she told him he had done good work. Cole Weatherby said he knew, and tipped his hat and went to find a meal and a bed. John Wayne returned his horse to the stable and settled his own board, and Annie settled hers, and they walked out into the main street of Broken Bow in the dark and the cold of October. She said she needed to go to the bank first thing Monday morning to arrange the deposit and the transfer, and that she needed him to be there as a witness to the transaction. He said he would be there. She said he was leaving Tuesday. He said that was his plan. She said she was grateful. He said it was a good drive. He meant it as a complete statement. She understood it as one. Sunday passed. Thomas slept late in the hotel room Annie had secured for him, and she brought him breakfast from the dining room. And they did not talk much because there was a specific kind of tired that comes after 2 days of hard cold work, and it does not permit conversation. He asked her if his mother knew they had made it. She said she had sent a wire from the railhead office the previous evening, and that his mother knew exactly what had happened. He ate his eggs and toast and looked out the window at the main street and asked if $35 a head was good. She said it was better than most people were getting this fall and that his mother's cattle were worth it and that Porter Stiles had known it. Monday morning, October 21st, Annie Oakley walked into the First National Bank of Broken Bow at 8:45 in the morning. John Wayne walked in behind her. Thomas Connolly walked in beside her. The bank had 6 people in it when they arrived. By the time they reached the counter, there were 9, because 3 people who had been passing the front window had come inside, and not one of them would later be able to explain exactly why, except that when those 3 people walked through that door, there was something in the room that made a person want to be present for whatever was about to happen. The teller was a young man named Elliot Fry, 23 years old, 3 months at the bank, who recognized Annie Oakley with the expression of a person encountering something from a different reality. She greeted him by name, because she had learned his name the previous week from Clara Stribling, and she placed the bank draft on the counter and said that she needed to deposit $4,305 to the account of the Connolly estate and to direct a payment of $214 from that account against the outstanding balloon note, and that she needed the transaction recorded and witnessed, and the note amendment documenting the payment executed before she left the building. Elliot Fry looked at the draft and at Annie and at the number and at John Wayne, who was standing 1 step behind and to the left with his hat in his hand, and Elliot Fry said he would need to get Mr. Voss. Nobody in that room moved. Harlan Voss came out of his office with the expression of a man who has been interrupted from something he considered more important, and then he saw the draft on the counter, and then he saw Annie Oakley, and then he saw John Wayne, and something in his expression reorganized itself without his permission. He was not a man who was easily impressed or easily moved, but he understood, in the way that certain institutional men understand things very quickly when money is involved, that the draft was real, and the demand was legal, and the documentation was going to happen whether he found it convenient or not. He said good morning. Annie said good morning. She repeated her instructions about the deposit and the payment and the note amendment. Voss looked at the draft and said that he would need to verify funds before proceeding. She said she understood and to please proceed. He took the draft to his office and came back 4 minutes later and said the funds were in order. She said good. He said he would need to prepare the amendment to the note documentation, which would require some time. She said she would wait. She sat down in one of the bank's 2 chairs. John Wayne remained standing. Thomas Connolly remained standing. The room was quiet in the specific way of a room where a great deal is understood and very little needs to be said. Voss prepared the amendment. It took 22 minutes. He brought it to the counter and explained the document to Annie. The balloon payment of $214 had been received and recorded. The note was returned to its original 15-year term and 7% rate, and no further acceleration clauses could be exercised without 60 days written notice to the note holder. Annie read the document. She read all of it. She asked one question about the acceleration clause language, and Voss amended one word in the clause before she accepted it. The document was signed by Voss on behalf of the bank and witnessed by Elliot Fry and by a depositor named Harold Swenson, who happened to be standing at the adjacent counter and who did not object to being asked. John Wayne signed the witness line as well. He signed his full name in the clear block letters of a man who had signed his name to many documents and intended every one of them to mean exactly what it said. Annie folded her copy of the amendment and put it in her coat pocket beside where the draft had been. She thanked Elliot Fry. She nodded to Harlan Voss. She walked to the door and held it open for Thomas and let him go through first. John Wayne followed. Outside, on the wooden sidewalk in the sharp October air, Thomas Connolly stopped walking and turned around and looked at the two of them. He was 11 years old, and he was trying to find words for something that did not fit cleanly into the vocabulary of an 11-year-old, which is to say, the vocabulary of most people. He looked at Annie, and he looked at John Wayne, and he looked back at Annie. She reached into her coat pocket and put the amended note into his hand, and folded his fingers over it and said to give it to his mother. She said his mother would know what to do with it. Thomas looked at the document in his hand. He looked up at her. He said something, started to say something, some form of thank you, in the way of children who have been raised with good manners and are trying to deploy them for a situation those manners were not built for. And Annie shook her head gently and said he should go get his horse. He went and got his horse. She did not watch him go. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the main street of Broken Bow in the October morning, the horses at the hitching posts, the smoke from the diner chimney, the pale light coming flat from the east. John Wayne stood beside her for a moment and said nothing, which was the right thing. He had done something the night before that she did not know about until later. Before leaving the bank on that Monday morning, John Wayne had stopped in Harlan Voss's doorway while Annie and Thomas were at the counter reviewing the amendment. He had said to Voss, in a voice that did not carry past the two of them, that he was familiar with the other 10 families in Custer County who held notes with acceleration clauses similar to the one just amended, and that he had a considerable acquaintance among the eastern investors who provided capital to regional banks in this district, and that he believed those investors would be interested to know how those clauses were being exercised in a year when farm prices were already at floor. He did not tell Voss what to do about this. He stated only what he knew and what he believed. He stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds, and then he left. Voss sat at his desk for a long time after that. Over the following 6 months, he did not exercise the acceleration clause on any of the remaining 10 notes. Several of those families never knew how close they had come, or what had caused the bank to pull back from the edge. But that is a separate story, and it belongs to those 10 families, not to this one. Annie Oakley left Broken Bow on a Wednesday, a day after John Wayne departed for Billings. She took the train south and caught the connection west and arrived in Kansas City on November 3rd, 3 weeks before the show was due to arrive. She found a room, and she practiced every morning in a field outside town, and she wrote Frank Butler a long letter that described, in her characteristic economy, what she had done for the past 2.5 months. Frank wrote back from Cleveland and said he figured she had spent at least 4 times what he had sent her. She wrote back and said roughly twice. He knew she meant 4. She sent Margaret Connolly a letter before she left Broken Bow. It said that the animals were well sorted and had driven clean, that Cole Weatherby had been reliable, that the middle loop crossing had been the hard part, but Thomas had handled it well, and that the remaining balance of the sale after the note payment and wages and expenses was $4,062 held in the Connolly estate account at First National. She said that she had enjoyed the work. She said she hoped the winter was gentle. She signed it with her full legal name, Phoebe Ann Butler, which was the name Frank's last name had given her, and the one she used for personal correspondence. She had not signed her public name to anything in connection with this matter because it had nothing to do with her public name. Margaret Connolly received the letter on a Friday afternoon in early November. She read it at the kitchen table while Bridget was setting the places for supper and Thomas was bringing in the wood. She folded it along its original creases and set it in the center of the table and looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and put it in the cedar box on the bedroom shelf, where she kept the documents that mattered: the deed to the land, the original note, Declan's birth record, the children's baptismal papers. She put it in there with all of those things and closed the box. That night she told Thomas what the letter had said about him handling the crossing. He did not say anything. He looked at his plate for a moment. Then he ate his supper. The winter of 1893 into 1894 was long and cold but not brutal, which is the best a person can hope for in western Nebraska in any given year. Margaret Connolly ran the Connolly Quarter alone through those months, with the competent, unhurried focus of a woman who knows exactly what the land requires and does not waste energy on what it does not. She hired a neighbor's boy, a 15-year-old named Carl Hendricks, for half-days through the deepest part of January, when the stock work was too much for one person and Thomas's school schedule could not be interrupted. Carl Hendricks cost her 40 cents a day. She paid it without difficulty because she had the money. By the following October, a full year after the drive, the Connolly Quarters books showed 3 consecutive balanced seasons for the first time in 5 years. The fall sale of 1894 moved 108 head at $36.50, a modest improvement over the previous year's price, and Margaret cleared enough to service the note, cover the operating expenses, and put $200 into the bank against the following spring's needs. $200 in reserve. For a ranch of that size, in that county, in that decade, it was not wealth. It was stability, which is a different and in many ways more durable thing. Thomas turned 12 in the autumn of 1894, and he was by then doing the work of a grown hand on the mornings before school, and every evening and full days on weekends. And Margaret watched him with the particular attention of a mother who knows her child has made a decision about who they are going to be. He did not talk about the drive often. He did not talk about Annie Oakley at all, in the way that children sometimes do not talk about the things that mattered most to them, as if discussing them would diminish something essential. But he kept the route in his head: the South Loop crossing, the Middle Loop stick in the gravel, the cattle lane into Broken Bow from the north, and he could describe every mile of it in the darkness of his own room without effort. because he had laid it down in the precise way that experiences lay down when they change the person having them. Bridget, who had been 8 at the time and had watched the drive leave in the pre-dawn dark from the porch beside her mother, remembered it differently. She remembered the lamp her mother held and the way the cattle had moved in the darkness like a single slow breathing thing, and she remembered that her mother had not cried when they disappeared, which Bridget thought was the most remarkable thing she had ever seen, and which she would describe exactly that way, in those words, every time she told the story for the next 60 years. Jimmy, who had been 4, did not remember the drive at all. He remembered a tall woman with quick eyes who had come to their place and talked to his mother for a long time on the porch, and who had let him touch the stock of her rifle, which was the only thing he retained from those weeks of crisis and resolution. He would not know until he was grown and reading a newspaper one autumn afternoon in 1926 that the tall woman with the rifle had been Annie Oakley. The ripple that moved farthest from the original event was not the one anyone would have predicted. It touched Roy Pettigrew, the dry goods clerk at Halverson's store, who had told Annie about the Connolly situation over a transaction of flour and lamp oil, and had watched the rest of it unfold from the periphery. Roy Pettigrew had been 26 in the autumn of 1893, and had been working the store counter for 4 years, and had been drifting in the specific comfortable way of a young man who has a job that meets his needs, and does not demand that he decide who he wants to be. He had watched Annie Oakley walk in and ask the right questions and then go out and do something with the answers, and he had watched John Wayne sign his name at the bottom of a bank document as a witness to a transaction that was not his business in any legal or financial sense, and the combination of those two observations had done something to him that he could not have precisely articulated. What it did concretely was this. Roy Pettigrew left Halverson's store in the spring of 1894 and opened a small lending operation of his own. Not a bank, but a private credit arrangement aimed specifically at ranch families who needed small short-term loans to cover the gap between operating need and harvest income. He charged 3%, which was half of what the First National charged on its commercial notes. He kept his books in a ledger he had bought at Halverson's before he left, and he never once exercised an acceleration clause, because he had not put any in his notes. He ran that operation for 31 years. He foreclosed on nobody. This is a documented fact, because Roy Pettigrew's ledgers were donated to the Custer County Historical Society in 1951 by his daughter, and the ledgers show 31 years of loans made and repaid, and no record anywhere of a foreclosure proceeding. The Connolly quarter remained in the family for decades beyond the crisis of 1893. Thomas Connolly took over its management from his mother in 1912, when Margaret was 59 and had developed arthritis severe enough to make the physical work impractical. He ran it for another 30 years, through 2 world wars, and a depression, and the drought years of the 1930s that broke ranchers across 100 miles of Nebraska grassland. The Connolly place survived the drought because Thomas had banked 3 dry years of reserve before it arrived, a practice he had learned from watching his mother, and a practice that cost him comfort in the good years and saved the place in the bad ones. He expanded the original 480 acres to 620 in 1928. Buying a neighboring parcel at a fair price from a family moving to California. He ran Hereford through the difficult years and added a small hay operation on the river bottom that provided reliable income when cattle prices swung down. He was, by every measure, a sound stockman and a careful steward, and the people who knew him best said he ran the operation the way his father would have, except with 20 extra years of knowledge that Declan had not lived long enough to gain. Bridget Connolly married a man named Horace Yarrow in 1907 and moved to Kearney, Nebraska, where she raised 4 children and taught school for 30 years, and told the story of the October drive at least twice a year for the rest of her life, always in the same way, the lamp in her mother's hand, the darkness, the cattle disappearing, her mother's dry eyes. She told it to her children and her students and her neighbors, and everyone who heard it agreed that the most remarkable thing was not the drive itself, or the money, or the bank, or the woman who had made it happen, but the image of Margaret Connolly standing at the pasture gate in the dark with a lamp, watching everything she had built in 14 years walk away into the night, and standing straight. Jimmy Connolly became a school teacher in the Platte River country, and then a principal, and he is not the center of this story, but he carried something from those early years that his students recognized without knowing its source, a specific quality of attention to children in difficulty, a refusal to apply bureaucratic solutions to human problems, a habit of doing the extra thing without being asked and without expecting acknowledgement. The amended note, the one Annie Oakley had folded and pressed into Thomas's hand on the sidewalk outside the First National Bank of Broken Bow on October 21, 1893, lived in the cedar box on the bedroom shelf until Margaret's death in 1931. After that, Thomas kept it in the same box, and after Thomas, his daughter kept it. By the time it was framed, it was 1952, and the woman who framed it was Thomas's daughter, Eleanor Connolly, who was 42 years old, and who had grown up hearing the story, in the particular way of a child who hears a story so many times that it becomes not a story, but a fact about the world, a fixed point from which all other things can be measured. Eleanor had the document framed in a plain oak frame and hung it in the front room of the ranch house, beside the door, where anyone coming in from outside would see it first. The signature at the bottom, John Wayne, in block letters, had faded to a pale brown. Annie Oakley's letter, written in her hand on the reverse side of a page that had once held a hotel laundry receipt, was matted beside it. The ink was darker than the signature. Her handwriting was small and even and precise, each letter made with the economy of a woman who did not waste motion in any medium. The frame stayed on the wall through 3 subsequent renovations of the ranch house, and one change of ownership when the Connolly family eventually sold in 1979. The buyers were a couple from Lincoln, Nebraska, who had come west looking for a working operation, and they were told the story of the frame when they made their offer, and they said they would leave it where it was. They were as good as their word. The document in the oak frame hung beside the door of the ranch house on the old Connolly quarter for another 22 years, and when the Lincoln couple's own children took over in the early 2000s, they left it as well, because there are some things a person inherits that they understand, instinctively, are not theirs to move. Annie Oakley rejoined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in Kansas City in December of 1893 and performed without interruption for another 12 years, through Europe and back across America, shooting things that people said could not be shot and making it look simple. She and Frank Butler retired to New Jersey and then to Ohio, back near Darke County where she had been born, and she spent her final years giving shooting lessons to young women, something she did with the same specific patience she had always brought to anything that needed doing. She died in November of 1926. Frank Butler died 18 days later. John Wayne was 70 years old in the winter of 1913 and had long since moved back to the upper Midwest, to a farm outside Sioux City, where he spent his last years without particular drama or prominence. He had done a great many things in his life, and the world knew about some of them, and did not know about others. He did not speak of Broken Bow to the people around him in Iowa, not because it was a secret, but because it was simply one of the things he had done, and he did not see the advantage of speaking about things you had done when they were already finished, and the people they had mattered for were 1,000 miles away living well. He died in 1915. The Sioux City newspaper ran 4 lines. He would have preferred 2. The thing that endured was not the document in the frame, or the story told in Kearney schoolrooms, or the entry in Roy Pettigrew's ledger, or any of the specific artifacts that time and people and careful keeping had preserved. Those things endured too, and they mattered, and they are real. But the thing beneath all of them, the thing they all pointed toward without being able to name it directly, was simpler and older than any of it. It was the image of a woman alone at a gate in the pre-dawn dark, holding a lamp, watching her life walk away into the darkness, and not looking away. And two people, one small and precise, one large and quiet, who saw that and could not unsee it, and who did the only thing that could be done, without fanfare or announcement, because the alternative was a world in which capable people looked away from that kind of courage and called it none of their business. In Custer County, Nebraska, they still know the word for what was done that October. They just call it decent, which is a small word for something that is, on examination, very large.